We're speaking with Andrew Whitelaw from Thomas Elder Markets. How are you, Andrew?
I'm good, thanks, Ricky. Hope all's well.
Yep, well, all's well for you and I on the personal front, but a couple of weeks ago we spoke. We've got maybe the start of World War III since then, and it's had a big hit on the wheat prices.
Yeah, it's horrific what's happening in Ukraine. It's a horrible event, and whilst grain prices being high are good for Australian farmers, when and if it flows through, we probably don't really want it to be on the back of this sort of level of human suffering.
Yeah, absolutely right. Are we seeing any ripples coming through on the Australian market at this stage, or is it really just across in Chicago we're seeing the rallies going on?
Yeah, well, what we saw last week, last Thursday when the invasion started, that the market rose, and it's basically, apart from one day, it's pretty much rose almost to its limits nearly every day. And so we've got prices like Chicago wheat futures for the coming harvest are 470 Aussie dollars a ton. For old crop, it's in the 500s. I think 575. So really, really strong numbers historically speaking for wheat futures. However, we're not quite seeing the same flow through when it comes to the actual price in Australia. We're seeing a little bit of a rise, which is welcome, but nowhere near the sort of rise that we're seeing in the overseas markets. So to give you an example, I think we're seeing 5% plus increases in futures each day, whereas we've probably seen about 5% increase in price physically, locally, since the invasion. So a fairly big gap. And what that's actually meant is that when we look at our grain prices around Australia, it doesn't matter which port you look at, you're basically talking about the lowest basis level on record. And that means when we talk about basis level, we're talking about the relative value to overseas futures, and it's basically the lowest or biggest discount that we've ever had. So our grain, relatively speaking, is the cheapest it's ever been, which is a bit of a concern for farmers because they're not getting all the value from overseas.
Yeah, we're looking at the Black Sea and this effective blockade there. Terribly, we're seeing ships being shot at and sunk and things like that. But when it comes to, I guess, that blockade, to what extent do overseas markets on the futures front start looking at Australian grain that they maybe don't look at so much because they can usually rely on the Black Sea resource?
Look, at the moment, there's basically no exports from the Black Sea. If you're sending a ship in there, you can't get insurance. The Ukraine Maritime Authority has said no ships are to leave ports, and it's just a big challenge for everybody in that region. Look, and that's what the big issue is that you basically shut off a big chunk, the biggest chunk actually, of export supply in the world, even if it's for a month. Which means that other people then have to go looking for that grain from elsewhere. And so they may look to other parts of Europe, they may look to Australia. Some of the concerns are, though, that in other parts of the world, like the Northern Hemisphere, stocks aren't necessarily that high because it's coming towards the end of the season. But then you look at Australia, and our logistics are already pretty full.
Yeah, we're an export-oriented nation, but we just don't push it out that fast in a situation like this.
Well, we've already working with a massive crop, and it's already booked out to go. But I guess it would be nice to see some of that overseas numbers flowing through eventually. Look, it all just depends on whether the trade can capture it and pass it on. So I guess we've got to worry about trickle-down economics.
When we look at that sort of the longer-term trend when it comes to the history of these we've seen these sorts of spikes before. What was it, around the GFC time, or was it even before then we had a spike in the price then?
Look, when you look at the wheat market, I'm talking about the global market really, because it's all the same, if you're looking at a longer-term trend. And what we tend to see is that the market is usually fairly stable in the longer term, but then it's characterized by these sort of really big spikes. I think 1996, 2008, 2011, 2012. where you had the market plodding along, and then boom, it just goes through the roof over the course of usually about 4 to 5 months. But when you look at that, it's quite often characterized by fairly sharp falls. And so we saw in those peaks, the month after the peak, we saw fairly hefty falls, 20% fall in price the month after it hits the peak. The key question is, well, will that happen this time? We don't know. There's a whole bunch of other fundamental factors driving the market even before Ukraine. But the other thing as well is, well, if the market is going to crash after the peak, we don't know that until it happens because, well, the market has rose considerably, very sharply, even compared to historical levels. Peak could be $100 a ton from here. Peak, in theory, could be $200 a ton from here, if the worst case scenario eventuates.
Yeah, and so when you talk about those dips or the troughs that come after that, the hangover, if I can call it that, do we end up at a worse position than when it started, or does it tend to sort of settle back to its pre-peak level?
But the wheat market is always fairly balanced in the longer term, so it tends to sort of basically return back to its normal level. I think the only exception was we had a lot of peaks, like we had 2008, 2011, 2012, all roughly a very short period of time, where it made investing in agriculture quite attractive, buying new tractors and using new technologies and whatnot. So we did see a fairly rapid expansion of agriculture in the early 2010s. So like 2010 to 2015. So we saw production and productivity go through the roof. And so we did see a period in the middle of the last decade where prices were pretty low for a couple of years. And that really is off the back of, people being invested in agriculture, thinking, well, prices are good, let's invest and let's take it to the next step.
Yeah, chatting with Executive Director of ABARES, Dr. Jared Greenville, yesterday about this, the $100 billion target for farm productivity in Australia by 2030. It's going to be risky to not just rest on our laurels that pricing's helping us get there quicker. We could have drought or other conditions and drops in prices before 2030. It's going to pay to sort of capitalise on the boom and spend well on getting there.
Yeah, well, I've got a different view on the $100 billion thing, to be honest.
Yep, tell us.
And when that was brought out in 2016, 2017, I think the $100 billion, basically all we've got to do is use if we use the value from that period where agriculture was worth, and then we just add the average inflation onto that, you get to about 98 billion.
Wasn't ambitious enough in your view?
Well, I think we're more than capable of 100 billion. To me, we're more than capable of getting 100 billion. We're at 88 billion, I think, this year, which is obviously price and production that's provided a golden opportunity. But going on, I think we've got way more than 100 billion by 2030, in my view. It should be quite easy to get there. In my view, it's not even a challenge, I don't think.
So since you mentioned the 100 billion, what about this? The National Farmers Federation have indicated they've also got a target by the same year, 2030, that 5% of farm income would come from ecological assets. It seems a little bit of green accounting might be another way they're covering themselves to make sure they get there.
Look, it's an interesting policy. We'll see on that one, on the biodiversity programs and whatnot, and whether they work. I guess from my point of view, I like to leave that kind of stuff to the market to decide whether they want to pay it rather than the taxpayer. I think we see issues in Europe where there's a lot of environmental accounting, and once the government has basically a stake in your farm, then you lose a little bit of control. But I just think I think the carbon farming sort of thing, where it is a case of you're basically you do it if the market is paying enough to do it. But if you sort of artificially make a market for it, there's not a huge number of companies that are willing to pay for biodiversity credits. So you effectively have to make a market and make a price up for it, really. So I think it's interesting. I'm not I'm not convinced that it's the most important thing for the average farmer.
Yeah, but you were about to say, before I interrupted you there, about the 100 billion target. Do you have a view it should be higher, or I gather you do?
Oh, I think. Look, agriculture will be. I'm pretty. Like, obviously, we could in 2030 it's just a number. We could have a bad year that year, but we should be aiming to be around about that level by 2030, and it should be relatively easy to get there, barring poor weather, obviously. But I think, look, the other thing as well to think about is we talk about farm value as being the important one. Like, I think it's equally important that we have, the whole agricultural supply chain. The whole agricultural supply chain is worth about 300 billion. And so, it's not just what happens on the farm. It's what happens in the abattoirs, what happens in the grain export companies, the value adding, the flour mills, the feed mills, the feedlots. So I think I like the idea of taking a whole of industry approach to it. Look, I think the industry's doing the right thing getting to these high numbers, but I think it's a case of, I don't think it's going to be that hard to get to 100 billion.
Yeah, and when you mentioned 300 billion, is that just a figure you've posted, or is that's a target you've seen written somewhere else?
Oh, I think that's a target from Agribusiness Australia, which is a group for post farmgate agriculture.
Yep. All right. Well, we might explore that one a bit further. Andrew, thanks so much for your views on that. We've always been kicking this 100 billion around, and whether it's too ambitious or ambitious enough, good to get your input. And thanks for joining us today on Flow.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Ricky.